Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The red earth of Umuozi always held memory. It clung to the soles of children and the heels of women heading to the stream. And during dry season, it rose like a rust-colored ghost behind the passing feet of market-goers. Life here wasn't lived in a rush. It unfurled, quietly and rhythmically, like a palm frond caught in a lazy breeze. People minded their homes, their farms, their churches. Neighbors knew each other's coughs, each other's roosters, each other's griefs. From the thatched roofs of Obina's compound to the faded signpost of Mama Azuka's pepper soup joint, Umuozi was stitched together by routine and silence. Yet in the very heart of the village stood a man who neither laughed loud nor lingered long, but who held more power over the village than even the council of elders. They called him James. No one quite remembered when the name replaced his birth name, Ikechukwu, or who had started it. The shift happened quietly, as if the village itself chose to forget what came before. His butchery, tucked neatly beside the Anglican church, was a modest building with sun-washed blocks, always smelling faintly of blood, smoke, and cold steel. James was a tall, broad-chested man, the kind whose footsteps didn't need a second introduction. His skin was dark and smooth, his eyes unreadable. There were no smiles in his conversations, only nods and calculated hums. But while his words were few, his meat was many, and that was enough for everyone. Every family in Umuozi, no matter their standing or status, had something from James in their kitchen. It wasn't just the quality of the meat, though that in itself was the talk of 4 villages. It was soft in a way no goat meat should be, tender even when barely cooked. It dissolved in pepper soup, didn't resist the chew, and held no sinew. People said it was blessed. Some joked that his knives were charmed by a spirit from the Ugwa Hills. Others said he'd learned his craft from a European soldier who stayed behind after the war. But no matter the myth, what baffled everyone was the price, so cheap it made no sense. A woman could walk in with 2 naira, and walk out with enough meat to feed 3 hungry children and a husband. At first, the wives were suspicious. If it's too good to be true, then it's not true, they whispered to each other while tying their wrappers at the stream. But week after week, year after year, no one got sick. No one fell ill. If anything, their meals became richer. The village's children stopped complaining of stomach grumbles at night. Husbands came home earlier, drawn by the scent of simmering stew. And so, slowly but surely, suspicions gave way to praise. James became a man of quiet reverence. People left coins and ripe bananas at his doorstep during festivals. He never attended weddings or funerals, but his meat always made it to the table. And in return, Umuozi left him alone. Yet the strangest thing about James was not his silence, nor his prices, nor even the taste of his meat. It was the way he lived, or perhaps the way he didn't. He had no wife, no known siblings, no children to call his own. His home, which sat just behind the shop, was small and bare, with a compound where cassava grew wild and a single mango tree stood like a solitary guard. He never entered the village square unless he had to. He never drank at the palm wine joints, never argued politics, never showed his teeth in laughter. He closed his shop at exactly 7 p.m. each evening, and reopened precisely at 5:45 a.m., not a minute late. But the most curious of all was what happened every Thursday. Without fail, at exactly 12:55 p.m., James would sweep the front of his shop, flip the sign to closed, and lock the door. For the next hour, no one saw him. No meat was sold. No firewood crackled in the backroom oven. Some said he prayed. Others said he slept. Once, little Chuka tried to peep through the side window. He saw nothing but shadows moving, slow, deliberate, unhurried. He ran home crying. From that day on, even the most playful children learned to keep their distance on Thursdays. Still, the villagers chalked it up to James being James. People with good meat and cheap prices earned the right to their odd habits. What no one dared to say aloud, though they all thought it, was that they didn't actually know where the meat came from. Not once had anyone seen a supplier offload crates. There were no delivery trucks, no cattlemen, no slaughtered goats in the backyard. Sometimes sharp cries echoed from the smokehouse at night, followed by the heavy clang of metal. But the villagers told themselves it was just the sounds of a man who worked hard. One time, Madame Chinello from Aware asked if she could watch him prepare a cut, just to learn. James gave her a long stare, wiped his hands on his apron, and said softly, "Not everything your eyes need to see." She smiled and nodded, but told her husband later that night, something no day balance. Her husband shushed her. "Are you hungry?" he asked. "Didn't you eat well?" And that was the end of that. In Umuozi, nobody wanted to dig where the earth felt warm. They had seen what happened when people went poking their noses where spirits were still sleeping. So they cooked the meat. They licked their fingers. They gave thanks. And in doing so, they turned their faces away from the things that scratched at the edge of their knowing. Because sometimes silence isn't just peace, it's protection. And James, the butcher, gave them enough reason to stay quiet. The first time Thomas Bacco walked into Umuozi, the air greeted him like an old aunt, warm, curious, and a little too quiet. He arrived in a faded Peugeot sent by the education board, clutching a worn leather satchel and a transfer letter that smelled of ink and disinterest. Nobody noticed him much that day. Children stared, men nodded, women lowered their gazes and whispered behind their wrappers. Umuozi did not take to strangers quickly. It had seen too many who came with noise and left with promises unkept. Thomas was placed in a small government staff quarters not far from the village's only borehole, a squat building with flaking yellow paint and window louvers that rattled when the wind turned. He didn't mind. His room had a wooden table, a creaky fan, and enough quiet to read. He had come from Kaduna by way of Jos, a man who'd buried more than a few chapters in his life, the kind who smiled gently and listened more than he spoke. To pass time he walked. Morning walks, evening walks, walks with no purpose other than the pull of his own thoughts. It was on one of these unhurried strolls that he first passed by the butchery. At first glance, it looked like any other roadside shop, concrete floor, wooden slabs, iron hooks. The smell of spice and smoke drifted out, strong but not unpleasant. What caught his eye, however, was not the meat or the man behind the counter, but the silence of the customers. A row of villagers stood outside the shop, each waiting patiently, each leaving quickly, as though afraid of lingering too long. It was peculiar, the way they avoided conversation, kept their heads down, and never, not even once, glanced into the smokehouse behind the shop. Something in that pattern lingered in Thomas's mind, like a scent you can't place. One evening, not long after settling into village life, Thomas found himself seated at Maman Jadika's makeshift beer stand, a low wooden bench beside a table covered in newspaper and sweating bottles of warm gulder. He wasn't much of a drinker, but it was one of the few places in Umuozi where men spoke freely. Beside him, Paan Wadinjo, a retired tailor with faded tribal marks and a cough that echoed into the night, muttered something between sips that made Thomas sit up. "Meat sweet past sugar these days," the old man said, wiping foam from his lips. "Since that girl disappeared, James meat day always plenty. Cheaper SEF. The others laughed softly, a hollow laugh, and quickly changed the subject to cassava yield. But that sentence lodged itself in Thomas's head like a pebble in a shoe. He turned it over again and again, recalling vague headlines he had glimpsed while traveling. Something about a missing girl from Umuozi, name forgotten, details fuzzy. Over the next few days, Thomas began to observe things differently. He walked past the butcher's shed more often, his steps slower, eyes sharper. He noticed that the back door never opened, even when the front was bustling. That the smokehouse always seemed active, yet no one ever entered it besides James. And then there was the matter of deliveries. There weren't any. Not once did he see a vehicle bring livestock or frozen meat. No trucks. No suppliers. The meat simply appeared, day after day, as if from the air. Most curious of all was what he heard late one Thursday night. As the moon sat fat and yellow above the trees, Thomas, lying in bed by the window, heard a sound, low, rhythmic, and wet, followed by a cry. Not the cry of a goat. Not even close. Thomas wasn't the kind of man to jump to conclusions, but he was the kind to keep notes. He scribbled small things in the margins of his journal, sounds, smells, expressions he caught when the villagers thought no one was looking. He began to piece together a picture that troubled him more with each passing day. A butcher with no visible source of livestock. A shed with locked doors and muffled sounds. A village that whispered but never confronted. Then came the incident that stripped all doubt from his mind. It was just after the first rainfall of the season. The ground was soft, the air alive with the scent of wet leaves. As he walked past the back of the butcher's compound, he paused near the smokehouse, where the fence had broken slightly, exposing a sliver of the rear yard. And there, in the thin slant of moonlight, something glinted. Curious, he stepped closer. Through the gap in the planks, he saw it, a small pale hand, curled and still, lying beside what looked like a pile of cloth. He froze, heart hammering, unsure if his eyes were betraying him. Before he could adjust his gaze, the cloth shifted, and the hand vanished. Thomas stumbled back, breath shallow, retreating quickly into the cover of darkness. That night, sleep came in fits, broken by dreams of hands reaching from soil and silver glints beneath meat hooks. What troubled him most was not the possibility of what he'd seen, but the reaction it stirred in him. It wasn't fear, not entirely. It was a deep, sinking sensation that somehow the village already knew. That the smiles were too thin, the silences too rehearsed. That everyone, in some corner of their hearts, had chosen not to ask the right questions. He began speaking to people, gently, indirectly. He asked about the girl who had gone missing. Most shrugged. She went to Onitsha, some said. To find work, others claimed. No one seemed to agree. No one offered dates. No one said her name. It was as though she had been lifted clean from the memory of the village. And yet, every path he followed led back to James. Every missing thread wove itself into the quiet hum of the butcher's knives. One afternoon, as he passed Mama Ujja's stall, he asked her casually if she ever noticed anything strange about the meat. She paused, hand resting on a basket of ugu leaves. You're not the first to wonder, she said, voice low. But people like to eat in peace. Ask too many questions, and you'll spoil your own appetite. With that, she returned to arranging her leaves. That was the moment Thomas understood. The village wasn't unaware. It was choosing to forget. Choosing to feast and forget. And something about that choice was more terrifying than any scream in the night. There was something about the earth behind the butcher's shop that didn't sit right with Thomas. It wasn't just the smell, although that too told its own stories. It was the way the soil seemed unusually loose, like it had been disturbed recently, and covered up in a hurry. Where most backyards in Umuozi hardened under sun, and where this one remained soft even during the dry season, as if the ground refused to forget what had been pushed into it. On the third Thursday of the month, as the village prepared for the yam festival, Thomas waited for the moment James closed the shop at his usual odd hour. From his hiding spot beneath a mango tree a few yards away, he saw the man step inside the shed, lock the door, and disappear behind the iron sheet wall. Thomas counted his steps carefully, waited until the world settled back into its usual quiet, then crept around to the back. The air shifted as he crossed the boundary into the yard. There was no breeze, no insect chatter, only an eerie, waiting silence. He knelt beside the loose earth, brushed away the top layer of dirt with trembling fingers, and uncovered a torn plastic sack. Inside were bones, not animal bones, not ones you'd find on a butcher's block. These were shaped differently. A rib, a vertebra, a femur small enough to belong to someone not yet grown. He covered his mouth to keep from retching. This was no mistake, no accident. He had found a grave. And it wasn't old. The bones still held the color of something recent. With panic threatening to take hold, he stepped back from the pit and scanned the area. That was when he noticed the faint shimmer of something silver near the foot of the mango tree. He reached down and picked up a ring caked in reddish mud, the metal cool and smooth against his palm. It was a thin silver band, unremarkable in design, except for the letters engraved on the inside. M.W. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. Margaret Wakoma. The missing girl whose name had become smoke in the mouths of the villagers. His hands trembled, the ring suddenly heavy, weighted not just with metal but with meaning. He stood there frozen, mind racing, heart thundering, when he heard something from the shed. A low sound, a slow drag like metal on floor. Then came footsteps. Not hurried, deliberate, measured. Someone was approaching from within the building. Thomas ducked behind the mango tree, pressing himself into its shadow. He dared not move. The footsteps paused. A moment passed. Then another. The quiet stretched until it hurt. Eventually, the sound of a bolt sliding into place echoed softly through the air, and the shed door creaked open. James stepped outside, wiping his hands on a stained apron, eyes scanning the yard. He looked around with a stillness that felt older than the trees. Thomas held his breath. After a while, the butcher turned and walked back toward the front of the shop, disappearing out of sight. Only then did Thomas dare to move. He didn't sleep that night. The ring lay on the table beside his bed, staring back at him like an accusation. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that pit, the bones curled like questions he couldn't answer. He wanted to tell someone, to run to the council or the pastor or even the police in the next town. But something held him back. It wasn't fear, not entirely. It was doubt. Would they believe him? Would anyone listen? He knew how Omuozi operated, how quickly ears closed and eyes looked away when truth grew teeth. Still, he needed help. So he went to the one person he felt could understand, the one person whose silence had always struck him as purposeful rather than ignorant, Mama Uju. She had been the village midwife for nearly 40 years. She delivered more children than anyone could count, buried 2 husbands, and never minced words. When Thomas showed her the ring, her face did not show surprise, only a sad kind of stillness. She took it from his palm, turned it in her fingers, and let out a breath so long it felt like something leaving her soul. This belonged to her, she said simply. Margaret, I remember when her mother bought it in Enugu. Gave it to her when she turned 16. She used to wear it on her smallest finger like a charm. Her voice didn't waver, but her eyes didn't meet his either. He asked if she believed what he'd seen. She didn't answer. Instead, she asked if he had time to walk with her. They left her compound just before sunrise, walking in silence toward the back of the butcher's property. The air was thick with dew, and the village still slept. As they reached the smokehouse, Mama Uju paused, pulling out an old iron key from her wrapper. This place used to belong to James's father, she said softly. He was different, quieter. He slaughtered cows. Real cows. Died suddenly, they say. After that, James took over. She inserted the key into a hidden lock beside the shed and turned it with a loud metallic click. The door opened with a groan, revealing the interior. It was darker than Thomas had imagined. Not just from the absence of light, but from the weight of what had been done inside. Meat hung from hooks, glistening. There was a cutting table in the center, stained a deep maroon that no scrubbing could ever remove. But the back wall was what caught Thomas's attention. It was newer than the rest. Cemented with clean bricks, barely aged. He stepped toward it. The smell changed there, sharper, fouler. Mama Uju didn't follow him inside. She remained at the doorway, eyes lowered. Thomas ran his hand along the wall, feeling for seams or openings. He knocked gently. The echo came back wrong. Hollow, like something was waiting behind it. He turned to speak to her, but she was already walking away, muttering prayers under her breath. He understood then that her silence had not been born of ignorance, but of helplessness. She knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to stay quiet. Enough to survive. And now, whether he wanted to or not, he carried a truth that could no longer be buried. The ring still sat in his pocket. And the bones, the wall, the silence, they were all waiting for someone to listen. The air in Omuozi began to shift, but only slightly, like the early warning breeze before a storm that hadn't made up its mind. Thomas moved through the village like a man carrying a mirror no one wanted to look into. The few times he tried to speak about the smokehouse or what he had seen near the mango tree, the responses were swift and slippery. Faces turned away, greetings became shorter, and familiar hands found urgent errands elsewhere. Even the children who used to wave and trail after him calling teacher, now avoided his eyes, their laughter cutting off whenever he passed. There was a quiet wall going up around him, built not with bricks but with avoidance. He saw it most clearly at Mom and Jadika's beer bench, where once he was welcomed with calabash smiles and drunken jokes. Now only 1 or 2 men sat in awkward silence when he approached, and they rarely stayed long. One evening, after dusk had fallen and the sky took on that familiar burnt orange hue, he found himself walking past the butcher's again, this time slower, more deliberate. From the side, beyond the flickering light bulb that hung lazily by its wire, he noticed something strange. A figure crouched near the waste pit, digging. Thomas stepped back into the shadows, unsure of what to make of it. The figure wore a wrapper and scarf, female, small-framed. He could not see her face. She dug quickly, methodically, tossing scraps aside. When she paused and stood, something dropped from her hands into a basket, and she hurried away toward the back fence. He waited until she disappeared into the trees before moving closer to where she had been digging. In the soft mud, footprints remained, shallow but clear. And near the edge of the pit, hidden beneath some singed banana peels, something glinted. Another ring. This one smaller, made of brass, but unmistakably a wedding band. No initials. Just a single, hairline crack running through the band like a fault in stone. The next morning, he returned to the spot. The ring was still there. He picked it up with a leaf and dropped it into his pocket. A part of him was beginning to unravel, like a sweater pulled loose by a careless nail. It wasn't just the evidence anymore. It was the growing certainty that the village was complicit, or at the very least, willfully blind. He began to document everything, sketching layouts of the compound, listing dates and times, writing names and observations in tight, tiny lines inside a notebook he kept hidden beneath his mattress. It wasn't just about Margaret anymore. It was about others too. Missing people he hadn't heard about until he started asking. Fidelia the groundnut seller, Clement the former security guard, one of the women from the cassava mill, who simply stopped showing up one day, and whose absence had been explained with a casual, "She went to live with her cousin in ABA." But no one ever confirmed these stories. They were always told with that same tone, soft, vague, avoidant. Meanwhile, James continued to run his shop as though nothing had changed. Every morning, the meat displayed on the counter was red, plump, cleanly sliced. Customers still came, though now they looked both ways before entering, and many no longer lingered for idle talk. There was a new stillness about James too, deeper than before. His eyes seemed emptier, not tired but worn, like wood exposed too long to the sun. He moved slower, measured. And though he said nothing, Thomas knew he had noticed the ring was missing. The grave near the mango tree had been recovered, packed firmer this time. The sack had disappeared entirely. Yet even with that knowledge, James hadn't made a single move toward confrontation. He simply continued. And that frightened Thomas more than any threat. One evening, as thunderclouds rolled across the distant hills and frogs began their nightly croaking, Thomas found himself knocking on Mama Ujja's door once again. She opened it slower this time, as if expecting a different kind of visitor. When she saw it was him, her face softened just enough to let him in. They sat in the corner room where the breeze slipped in through woven raffia mats, and the smell of camphor hung in the air like a quiet warning. He told her about the second ring, the woman digging, the recovered grave. She listened without interruption, hands folded over each other, eyes never straying from his face. When he finished, she stood up and lit a kerosene lamp, placed it on the table between them, and said something that took the wind out of his chest. "This is not the first time someone has come to question the butcher," she said. "There was a boy 10 years ago, youth corper, came from Bainway. Bright, curious, always writing things down. One day he asked too much. The next, he packed his things and left. But he left behind his journal. I kept it. I shouldn't have, but I did." She went to a small cupboard, pulled out a cloth-wrapped bundle, and handed it to Thomas. Inside was a water-stained notebook filled with short notes, sketches, and dates. The writing was rushed, uneven. Names appeared again, names Thomas recognized. Not just the missing ones, but James, and his father. There was even a rough sketch of the smokehouse, and beneath it, a line scrawled in bold. "The meat is not goat." Thomas's hands shook as he turned the pages. He looked up at Mama Ujju, whose eyes glistened now with tears unshed. "I was younger then," she whispered. "I didn't want trouble, but I always knew something was wrong. Some truths are heavy, too heavy for one person to carry. That's why they stay buried." That night, Thomas returned home with the notebook pressed to his chest, its weight heavier than any textbook he had ever carried. He didn't eat, didn't write, just sat in silence, watching the darkness press itself against his window. At some point, he lit a candle, opened the notebook again, and reread every page. Then he opened his own journal and began cross-referencing names and timelines. There were overlaps. The corporal had noticed patterns too, disappearances followed by meat surplus. Seasonal rhythms that didn't match the livestock cycle. Days when the shop closed early, only for a new face to vanish quietly the following week. The more Thomas read, the more a new fear bloomed inside him. Not just that James had been doing this for a long time, but that he wasn't working alone. The woman he'd seen digging. The convenient stories villagers told about where people had gone. The elders who never asked questions, who never summoned James to give account. It wasn't just silence. It was complicity. The entire village had made a decision long ago, to eat and forget, to hush and move on. And those who resisted that rhythm either vanished or fled. The question that now loomed like thunder behind his ribs was chilling in its simplicity. What happens when you refuse to forget? The morning James was taken, the rain fell sideways, sharp and stubborn, as though it too had waited too long to speak. It began before dawn, a thick gray downpour that washed the dust off zinc roofs and drove even the earliest risers back into their beds. But while the rest of Umuozi stirred beneath raffia mats and wool wrappers, Thomas stood near the roadside beneath his small umbrella, watching as the police van pulled into the village with no sirens and no noise. It had taken him weeks to send the letters, longer still to get a response. He had written everything down, names, dates, evidence, journal pages, and sent them off to an old university friend who now worked as an investigator in Enugu. Whether it was what he wrote, or simply the smell of rot rising from the village, the authorities had finally responded. The officers who stepped out were not in uniform. They wore plain clothes, moved with quiet precision, and said little. One went straight to the smokehouse. Another to the back of the butcher's compound. The third approached James, who was already outside, seated under the eaves, his apron still tied, as though he had known they were coming. He didn't run, didn't speak, just looked at them with the same calm he gave his meat, unflinching, passive, indifferent. When they led him into the van, he didn't struggle. Thomas watched it all from behind the low concrete fence near the borehole. Something inside him twisted, not with guilt, but with something he couldn't yet name. Something that sat between justice and loss. After James was taken, the village grew quieter than ever before. Not in the usual peaceful way Omuozi had always known, but in a heavier, more uncomfortable silence. People whispered, not because they feared what had happened, but because they feared what would happen now. There was no formal announcement. No town hall. No statement from the council. The butcher's shop was shuttered, the padlock rusted overnight, as though even the metal wanted no part in what had once lived inside those walls. At the market, meat from other villages began to arrive, harder, pricier, unfamiliar. Women complained about the toughness, about how it didn't melt in the pot the way James' cuts had. Someone muttered at the well that maybe it wasn't only the meat they missed, but the convenience it offered. Thomas noticed the shift, subtle but unmistakable. He was no longer the man they avoided. He had become something worse, a man who made them face themselves. Eyes turned away when he passed. Children were pulled closer to their mothers. Even Mama Uju, who had once welcomed him into her home, now kept her greetings short, strained. He understood. The truth had a price. And in Omuozi, peace had always depended on not counting what was missing. Yet now, with the butcher gone and the smokehouse empty, the gaps began to show. Faces once seen every day were no longer discussed. Names once mumbled in passing had become tombstones without graves. The village couldn't bury the truth because it had no soil left to dig. Thomas remained in Omuozi, not because he felt triumphant, but because something held him there, a sense of unfinished business, of wounds still raw and waiting. He spent most days inside, going over the notes in both his journal and the one left behind by the youth corporal who had vanished years before. There were pages he hadn't noticed before, faint pencil markings almost erased by time. Drawings of the smokehouse interior, arrows pointing to the back wall, small numbers, possibly counts. For on one page, then 3, then 5. It dawned on him that the corporal might have been keeping track of how many came in and never came out. The more he read, the more he saw a pattern. Thursdays. Always Thursdays. It explained James' ritualistic midday closings. What chilled him more was the note at the bottom of the final page. I think someone helps him. He's never alone on Thursday. That thought lingered like smoke in a closed room. The woman he'd seen digging. The elders who never questioned. The ease with which lies were accepted. Maybe James had only been the face. Maybe the roots of it went deeper. The idea made his chest tighten. He walked through the village each evening, not as a teacher, not even as a witness, but as someone haunted by the knowledge that evil, when wrapped in familiarity, becomes something worse than monstrous. It becomes normal. One afternoon, weeks after James was taken, Thomas returned to the smokehouse one last time. The doors had been sealed by the authorities, but the back fence was broken again. He stepped inside carefully, the air thick with the stale scent of old blood. The hooks were empty now. The cutting board stood alone like an altar abandoned by its priest. He walked slowly, eyes scanning every inch, then paused near the back wall. He pressed his hand to it, knocked. The echo remained hollow. With a piece of broken wood, he chipped at the corner, and the cement gave way more easily than he expected. Beneath it was another layer, thin wood, masking a hidden room no larger than a coffin. Inside were sacks, torn and moldy. Bones, still marked with butcher cuts. But what caught his eye most was a small red scarf, balled up and wedged into a corner. It was patterned with faded flowers. He recognized it immediately. It belonged to the girl from the river path, the one who used to sing as she carried palm kernels in her basin. Her name had been Chinyere. He hadn't heard it in months. No one had. As he stood there, staring into that cramped space where silence had once lived like a god, he realized that nothing had been solved. James may have been removed, but the disease had not been cut out. It still pulsed beneath the village, in the way people lied to themselves, in the way the council had gone mute, in the way the truth was already being forgotten. He didn't weep. He just closed the panel, stepped out of the smokehouse, and locked the door again. Some stories didn't end. They just sat in the walls, waiting. The sky above Umuozi never looked different, even after everything. Clouds still drifted in lazy clusters across the blue, and the evening sun still stretched its orange fingers across rooftops and hillsides. The village remained physically unchanged, but something beneath its surface had shifted. Something that couldn't be seen but could be felt, like the faint hum of a bee just before it stings. With James gone, there was no more smoke rising from the back of the butcher's shop. The cracked walls remained, the padlock rusted, the compound overgrown with weeds that had crept up slowly, as if reclaiming what the village no longer wanted to remember. People adjusted their routines with eerie swiftness. Meat now came from Yuba Junction, brought in by traders who drove noisy vans and sold loudly in the square. The taste was different. It lacked that strange tenderness James had become known for. It chewed harder, stayed longer in the pot, clung to teeth. Complaints came and went like short rains, but no one mentioned James by name. It was as if his presence had been erased like chalk on a board. When children asked where the meat man had gone, their mothers clicked their tongues and changed the subject. No one pointed to the smokehouse anymore. No one said his name during prayers. But silence, like a seed, grows roots. And soon, things that should have been exorcised began to echo again. Someone whispered that James had once saved a girl from a snake bite near the river. Another swore they saw him offer free meat to a widow who had no coin. The stories were always small, harmless, almost redemptive. And just like that, a soft erosion began, not of guilt, but of clarity. The darkness they once feared began to wear a different face. Thomas could feel it happening. He watched it creep back into conversations, subtle at first, hidden behind new proverbs and old memories. There were suggestions that maybe James had not been as bad as people made him out to be. That he was misunderstood. That he did what he did to feed the village, not for selfish gain. No one denied the bones. No one questioned the blood. But somehow, the horror had become explainable, digestible, like the meat itself. Thomas stayed mostly indoors now. His lessons at the primary school were reduced to 2 days a week. The children came quietly, avoided eye contact, recited their vowels like it was a debt they were paying. Their laughter had dulled, even during break periods. He began to notice how people stopped meeting his gaze. Not out of fear anymore, but with the kind of look given to someone who had overstayed their welcome. Mama Uju had stopped speaking to him altogether. The market women no longer waved. Even the village dogs didn't follow him. He was not hated, but he was something worse, inconvenient. He had pulled back the curtain on something Umuozi had decided to live with, and for that, he had become an infection to their comfort. What was once seen as bravery was now regarded as disturbance. He would hear murmurs when he passed the well. Since teacher started digging, peace has left our village. Another time, an elder muttered, "Not every truth needs mouth." The weight of knowing became heavier than he could carry, but he carried it still, every single day, because the alternative was letting it rot quietly under the soil like the others. Weeks passed, and then months, and slowly even Thomas began to lose grip on the sharpness of the memory. The details blurred, not because they mattered less, but because the mind, like the body, finds ways to survive when the burden is too heavy. He would wake at night and hear sounds that weren't there, chains rattling, knives tapping against stone, the low hum of the freezer that had long been unplugged. He tried to write. At first, he planned to send an article to a newspaper in Enugu. But every draft felt hollow, every paragraph too clean. The story on paper didn't capture the silence. It didn't capture the smell. And so he tore the pages, one by one, until only the original journals remained, his and the one from the corporer. He buried both in a rusted tin box behind the staff quarters, beneath a guava tree no one paid attention to. Not out of fear, but fatigue. Some truths were meant to be held, not shared. Not because they were too sacred, but because they were too heavy to hand off. One night, he walked past the old shop again. The lock had broken off, likely from rust, and the door creaked open slightly with the wind. He stepped inside. The counters were still there. So were the hooks. Cobwebs clung to every corner. The floor was covered in dust, but in one spot near the center of the room, a clean patch of cement remained, as though something heavy had recently been removed. He stood there in the dark, breathing in the past, letting it press against his chest like an old scar. Then he left, closed the door behind him, but didn't lock it. Let the wind take it. By the time the next dry season arrived, Thomas had made his decision. He packed his books, folded his clothes, and took one last walk through the village. The trees still bent in the same direction. The stream still whispered its stories against the rocks. But the people, those had changed. Or maybe he had. He greeted them politely. Some returned the gesture, others looked away. He didn't stop at the church, didn't visit the school. He simply walked past the farms, past the broken sign that welcomed visitors to Umuozi, and onto the road that led out. There was no ceremony, no goodbye, just the fading sound of footsteps on gravel. Behind him the village continued, slow, enduring, unchanged to the naked eye. But beneath its surface something slept. Not guilt, not even grief, just a practice forgetting. Somewhere near the stream, a child would one day find a bone, smooth, pale, shaped nothing like a goat's. She would show it to her mother, who would snatch it quickly, toss it into the bush, and say nothing. Life would go on. Stews would still be stirred. Songs would still be sung. But in the quietest moments, when the wind blew just right, the village would remember. Not with words, not even with feelings, but with the unspoken understanding that once, for years, they ate the truth and called it meat. Sometimes silence isn't peace. It's just fear dressed in quiet. And when a community chooses comfort over truth, darkness grows in familiar places, in homes, in routines, even in blessings that come too cheap. So here's a word of advice for you. Never ignore the small signs. Don't trade your conscience for convenience. Don't keep quiet when your spirit tells you something is off. Let your heart never become a place where wickedness can hide. May you always have the strength to speak, even when silence is easier. May your eyes never go blind to evil, even when it wears a friendly smile. May your hands never be used to cover what should be exposed. May your home never feast on sorrow disguised as provision. May your life be surrounded by truth, covered in light, and guarded by God's mercy. May you never be comfortable in a place where your spirit is restless. And when trouble walks near your door, may the Lord keep you 10 steps ahead. If your heart agrees, say a loud and joyful amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.